George Schlackett,
the one and only.
once went to Belize.
In January 2013, I was at the beginning of a 3-month adventure, cycling across Central America on my 1980s Norco Sasquatch bike that I had adapted for touring with some very basic modification. I can sum up those modifications in a couple of sentences here because they were so few. Of course, I had added fenders and racks, front and rear. At the time, I was using a lowrider rack in the front and a pretty ordinary rear rack. Another modification was the stem and handlebar combination to allow for a more upright seating position, which I prefer on long rides. The brakes were swapped for a type of cantilever that does not swing out very far when released, so it wouldn't interfere with the panniers. The 18-speed 3 and 6 setup was left untouched, except for a freewheel with a large climbing gear. I think this one had 32 cogs, but it could have been 34. I had started the tour in Cancun, and my daughter Jennifer had accompanied me for the journey to Tulum, even though she had moved by bus. On January 14th, Jennifer had left Tulum to catch her flight back to Canada, and I had continued on to a town by the name Carillo Puerto. I did not need my climbing gear on my way across Quintana Roo because the road was perfectly flat. Even after Carillo Puerto, this didn't change. Next stop on my journey was Bacalar, a town situated at a lake that was truly beautiful. The ride was 115 kilometers, so I was tired at the end of the day. I easily found a campground at the shore of the lake, and as if this was planned, it started raining as soon as I had pitched my tent. Later, I took a quick walk to town to get some food. I left my bike and all my belongings behind except for my handlebar bag with my wallet and my passport. There was a young couple in the spot next to mine, also in a tent. Otherwise, there was no one. This Lake Bacalar is actually a good distance away from the ocean, and the water is very calm. I got to swim in it the next morning after admiring the beautiful sunrise that soon gave way to a hot, sunny day. That was January 16th. My ride was short that day because Chetumal was just 40 kilometers away on Route 307. Chetumal is basically a border town. Next on my route would be a ride through parts of Belize, a country I had never been to. Before reaching Chetumal, I stopped at a gas station with an OXXO store to get a cold drink. That's when I first met Jan, another cyclist from the Czech Republic. When I pulled up, he was sleeping in the shade just outside the store on the floor. We had a conversation and I found out that he too was on his way to Panama. His plan was to cross into Belize right away that afternoon. I gave it brief consideration, but my skin was starting to burn from the intense sunlight, and I ended up sticking to my plan of spending a night in Chetumal. I had to ask my way around to find a hostel, but eventually found a really good one. The owner, a lady, treated me like an old friend. She suggested some great places to eat supper, and that's what I eventually did, besides walking around to explore this town after the sun had started setting. The next morning I had a quick breakfast and coffee at the hostel before saying goodbye to the owner. This was the day I was leaving Mexico. I had read on the internet that I was going to be asked for a departure fee, but that there was supposedly a way around paying it by telling the Mexican border guard that I wasn't going to return to Mexico on this trip. However, once I got there, I was charged a departure fee of, I think, 50 pesos. There was no way to argue my way out of it. But it wasn't a huge amount that was going to break the budget. It was more like the price of a meal, and I kind of suspect that this is what it ultimately paid for. See, Mexico is funny that way. Having said that, it didn't take me long to miss Mexico. Belize was different, but definitely interesting right from the get-go. I remember the road to Corozal that seemed longer than it actually was. Traffic was quiet, but the cars that passed me were driving faster than the ones in Mexico, or at least it seemed that way. In Corozal, the first thing I had to do was find an ATM to get Belize Dollars. To my surprise, I ran into a Canadian couple from Edmonton who guided me toward the CIBC Bank downtown. As it turned out, one Belize dollar was about 50 cents Canadian, which made calculations even easier than in Mexico. It all felt almost like home, except that the weather was warm and there were palm trees along with the beach. The language in Belize is English, but Spanish also seems to be popular. No problem finding cheap accommodation at the City Lights guest house. There was a lot of time left in the day, so I spent it walking around, eating a great meal, and even talking to some locals. I also managed to pick up a half-decent map of Belize and decided to move on to Orange Walk the next day, about 50 kilometers away. I got started relatively early with that idea in mind when I bumped into Jan again. He had also stayed in Corozal, and we exchanged stories about our border crossings and travel plans. Jan told me about Lamanai, a famous Mayan site that was apparently within reach that day. We decided to explore it together, and so we ended up riding together for a good stretch, all the way to Orange Walk. This was where Jan wanted to stop and check his email. I briefly considered stopping as well, especially since this had been my original idea, but then decided to move on as Jan indicated he'd be in Lamanai later that night and we'd catch up there. I have to say that I really underestimated the ride to Lamanai. It was another 60 kilometers or so, but the road wasn't smooth and well indicated as the ride through Belize had been up to that point. While the area was flat, it took me through a Mennonite agricultural area that made it seem like I had time traveled back into the 19th century. At one point, I was on a really rough country road following a couple in a horse and buggy combination. Yes, Lamanai was that way. Understanding them was difficult, as their first language was a German dialect that is not commonly spoken, even in Germany. When I asked to take a picture of them, they agreed reluctantly, but I could sense some kind of unease. I later learned that some Amish tribes don't allow photography at all, but Mennonites generally do. I still altered their faces because they may not be okay with appearing on YouTube. After what seemed like an eternity on dusty country roads, I finally made it to the village of Indian Church, where the archaeological area was located. It was easy to find a place to eat and a cheap room in a guest house. This place was very basic and power was available only for 3 hours between 6 and 9 p.m., supplied by a generator. There wasn't much to do after 9, so I fell asleep shortly after, tired from the long ride. I had no idea if Jan had made it to Indian Church, but the next morning I checked out of the guest house and made my way toward the Mayan ruins. It turned out that Jan was there. He had talked the security guard into letting him camp within the park, which is normally not allowed. However, his night had been a very rough one, as all he had for gear was a sleeping pad, a sleeping bag, and mosquito net. There were howling monkeys in that park, the kind that sound like lions when they howl. Jan admitted that he had barely slept at all. We spent the morning together checking out the Mayan ruins, which we had almost to ourselves. They were simply mind-boggling, not just due to their size, but also the state of preservation and the location in the jungle. I would strongly recommend visiting Lamanai to anyone who visits Belize. The easy way to get there is actually by boat from Orange Walk, but I have no idea how much this costs. We had to cycle back to Orange Walk in the afternoon using the same dusty roads through the Shipyard Mennonite community. I eventually lost Jan, who was cycling at a faster pace. I was glad when I found an inexpensive hotel with a private bathroom that night. Jan and I met again the next day on my way south. He was just having a drink at a roadside store, so we hooked up again and continued riding together for the afternoon. We were both planning to avoid Belize City, which was supposedly a very rough place ruled by competing gangs prone to gun violence. To this day, I'm wondering how bad it could really have been and remain a bit curious about the city by the ocean. But a town by the name Dangriga seemed like the better alternative to spend a couple of days on the coast to enjoy the ocean. For the day, however, the destination was the Guanacaste National Park near Belmopan. That also allowed camping. Jan found a creative way to set up his mosquito net on a picnic table under a shelter. But just looking at it made me very grateful for having my little tent. The park had a great deal on meals as well as the staff was friendly. When Jan and I both talked about going to Dangriga by bicycle, our host told us,
Don't even think about it.
the road looked paved, at least on the map, but apparently had never been completed. What were the options? Jan decided to stick to his plan and gave it a go on what was supposed to be a very rough dirt road for most of the way. Much later, I found out that he had made the journey, but that Dangriga had been a disappointing tourist trap with very high prices. I decided to go on to San Ignacio, close to the Guatemala border, and perhaps cross into Guatemala a day later. Well, the next day started with a good breakfast, buffet style, all part of the stay at this park. I took my time packing up the tent. Jan and I had met a couple from Germany who were traveling the world in a unique kind of 4x4 camper van, and of course, we were curious about their journey. We parted ways a short while later. My ride was relatively short that day on the main highway, but it was also the first time of the entire trip that I had some real hills to climb. It wasn't too bad as my bike worked well and I had enough time to pace myself. I had lunch in a village called Ontario at Sheena's Bistro. Sheena, who had grown up here and was running the place pretty much by herself, told me that the town had been renamed years ago because missionaries from Ontario, Canada, had established a base here. The founder of the mission had died in a car accident while hauling supplies. San Ignacio was not very far, which was good. The day was extremely hot, and I had run out of sunscreen somewhere south of Orange Walk. I had tried to purchase some more brand name sunscreen along the way, but only found a kind of whitening cream, which supposedly had a sunblock component to it. There's no sun protection factor marked on the tube, so buying it had been a last resort. However, it must have worked because I didn't get burnt any worse than with the name brand stuff. I was almost in Sam Ignacio when I stopped along the road to go pee. It's always difficult to find a good spot for that in an unfamiliar town, so I wanted to empty my bladder before getting there. The problem was that I did it while standing in an anthill, which I only noticed when it was too late. The result were hundreds of ant bites and a swollen calf that actually had me quite worried later that evening because my foot was getting numb. After some searching and asking around, I found an inexpensive place to camp just on the outskirts of town. Sam Ignacio seemed like a pretty popular spot with backpackers and even hippies. Hostels and hotels were a bit more expensive here than expected, and some had no vacancy at all. I ended up camping right next to a group of soldiers who had only tarps and hammocks for shelter, which was probably ideal for the location, except perhaps protection from the mosquitoes. Nighttime temperatures were definitely too warm for my sleeping bag. In spite of my numb foot, I still took time to walk around town and eat supper at the market. My Belize dollars were now close to running out, which was okay because the Guatemala border was nearby. When I talked to local people at the market and told them where I was going, they all warned me against traveling to Guatemala by bicycle.
It's the Wild West.
One guy told me.
Lots of crime there, and you're not safe on your bike.
I had heard similar claims before. It brought me right back to December of 2009 when for the first time I had crossed into Mexico by bicycle from Texas. This time it had little effect on me because Mexico had turned out to be a very safe country despite its reputation. The night was a bit rough. I didn't sleep well due to my swollen calf and numb foot. Massaging my foot helped with circulation, but it kept me awake. I was also uncomfortably warm until the wee hours when I eventually passed out. The next morning my foot was better. It still felt funny, but I knew now that it wasn't as serious as I had feared. Was this the day for me to cross into Guatemala? The border was less than 10 kilometers from here. There's only a border town by the name of Benque Viejo to pass through on the highway, but there was also a world-famous archaeological site, the Mayan ruins of Xunantunich. Having already seen the ruins of Lamanai, I wasn't even sure if I wanted to stop there and spend another half day or so seeing more pyramids, but in the end, decided last minute to take the ferry to the site. I had to do something with my last Belize dollars, and this seemed like the golden opportunity. The ruins were worth it. A guide who took visitors around in small groups actually showed us from the top of one of the taller pyramids where the border was. Once again, I got to listen to how chaotic Guatemala was supposed to be compared to Belize, even though no one had asked. To me, it all looked like jungle, mysterious and beautiful. It was past lunchtime when I left the ruins, but I had no Belize money to speak of now. I was going to cross into Guatemala, find an ATM in the town of Mejor de Mencos, and eat there. Then I had to find a map. I had not accessed the internet since Guanacaste and had no idea what expected me down the road. Shortly after leaving the ruins, I met a young couple, also on bicycles. They were Jackie and Julio, who were heading north. We stopped for a brief moment to swap information about the road ahead. I found out that there was supposed to be a town with a great hostel I could reach that evening just at the turnoff to the famous Tikal Mayan ruins, and that there wasn't much in terms of accommodation and mejor de mencos. It all sounded really simple. Now I had no time to lose and headed straight for the border. Crossing from one country into another by bicycle is always an adventure. It is more so when you have no idea what expects you on the other side. As mentioned, I didn't even have a map of Guatemala. You might say I was ill-prepared. In the next episode, I'll tell you how that all turned out for me. Was Guatemala really such a rough place? I sincerely hope you'll join me for the ride. Why not hit the subscribe button right now, and while you're at it, smash the like button until it turns blue. I stole that line from a very famous YouTuber who can tell you a lot about money, but probably wouldn't dare to travel to Central America on a bicycle. You don't need to be rich to live the dream. For more on that, watch the videos on the screen right now. Thank you.